Hi, I am Victoria. From the start, my relationship with my mother-in-law has been anything but smooth. It's always felt like she made it her mission to make me feel unwelcome, never hiding her opinion that I wasn't the right partner for her son. Things only got more strained when my husband and I bought our first home together, with him contributing financially. She seemed to take every opportunity to criticize my decorating choices, even going so far as to gift us decorations that clashed with our style. And as if that wasn't enough, she spread false rumors about me to my husband, trying to drive a wedge between us. Despite the pain, I tried to convince myself that time would heal things. I figured it was best to stay out of it and let things work themselves out, but eventually, I reached a point where I had to stand up for myself. In an effort to ease the tension, I invited her to dinner, hoping to smooth over the rough patches. I put a lot of effort into preparing a meal that I thought she would enjoy, following my husband's suggestions. Unfortunately, from the moment she sat down, she barely touched the food and immediately began criticizing it. She compared it to something that wouldn't even be fit for animals and made it clear that I had no real cooking skills. Despite my explanation that the dinner was a gesture of goodwill, not a culinary showcase, she dismissed it all. Her response was cold and cutting, implying that marrying her son wasn't an achievement in her eyes, and she continued to belittle me throughout the night. It was clear to me that she wasn't interested in resolving anything. To make matters worse, my husband stayed neutral, choosing to sit back and let the women figure it out. That lack of support from him only deepened my frustration, making me feel even more isolated in my own home. This incident made it painfully clear how difficult it is to navigate my relationship with my mother-in-law. It also highlighted the lack of support I often feel from Brian. When problems arise, he usually advises me to ignore her behavior and give her a pass. One moment that stands out is my aunt's birthday celebration. She had transformed her basement into a creative space, offering painting and wine as the perfect way to unwind. It seemed like the ideal evening for relaxation, until my mother-in-law showed up. "Happy birthday, Auntie. This setup is brilliant. Combining painting with wine is such a great idea," she said, entering with her usual confident air. I greeted her warmly, trying to stay positive. "Thank you, dear. I thought it would be a nice way to help everyone relax," my aunt replied, clearly pleased with my response. But my excitement quickly faded when I realized who was joining us for the evening. "I'm surprised Diana's here," I confessed. "Oh, Diana and I get along great. I really admire her sense of style. Sorry for not mentioning I invited her, but I thought it might help ease the tension. After all, she's family," my aunt explained, aware of the friction between Diana and me. I sighed. She really knows how to make things difficult. "I understand. Just try to enjoy the evening, and don't let her get to you," my aunt advised, offering some comfort. The evening took an awkward turn when Diana, wearing an eye-catching but somewhat inappropriate shirt, ended up spilling paint on herself after having a bit too much wine. My aunt and mom rushed over to help her, and not wanting to leave my mother to handle the situation alone, I reluctantly joined them in the cleanup. That's when I overheard a conversation that made my stomach drop. Diana was talking about Gabriel, my husband's old rival, who was now romantically involved with her. Gabriel, who had a history of being cruel to me, was someone Brian couldn't stand. The fact that Diana was bragging about Gabriel's transformation and how well he treated her made me feel uneasy, knowing that Brian would be furious if he found out. As we continued talking, Diana's attitude only became more antagonistic, and my own frustration grew. Brian's reluctance to confront his mother or defend me made me feel even more unsupported. At this point, I realized that waiting for Brian to address the situation wasn't going to solve anything. I needed to confront Diana directly and set some boundaries for the sake of my own peace and dignity. In the end, I knew this was a conversation I had to have on my own, and I was determined to take control of the situation, even if it meant standing up to Brian's family on my own. In my discussions with Brian, I've told him that it feels like his mother is intentionally trying to create conflict between us, though he always denies it. The truth is, I can't keep ignoring the tension, and I'm ready to face it head on. "What do you mean? I've never done anything like that," he'd argue, but the evidence was undeniable. Take the dinner I spent hours preparing, for example. He barely touched his plate, choosing instead to respond to my attempts at conversation with thinly veiled criticisms. "Oh, I just wasn't feeling well." He'd brush off his behavior, dismissing it as if it didn't matter. Then, there was that night at my aunt's party. He showed up wearing an overly revealing shirt and ended up drinking too much, spilling paint all over himself. It was such a spectacle that my mom and aunt had to rush to help. "It was just a mistake," he insisted, minimizing it as though it had no deeper consequences. And don't even get me started on Gabriel, Brian's childhood nemesis, who's now involved with him romantically. I've never understood why Brian would choose to be around someone who has treated him so poorly in the past, someone he's always despised. "Gabriel's a different person now. Brian should move on," he'd say, completely disregarding how the situation was affecting me and our relationship. I reached a breaking point and told him that he needed to tell Brian about this new relationship, or I would. It was becoming harder to ignore the growing chasm between us, a chasm that seemed to deepen with each unresolved issue. This sense of distance was only made more apparent by a phone call that made me realize just how little Brian was truly engaged in our life together. Living with him felt like living with someone who was completely disconnected from the daily realities of our home. He spent most of his time lounging, avoiding any responsibility or contribution to our shared life. This apathy extended beyond household duties and into our emotional connection. He often dismissed my feelings, leaving me to deal with everything alone. Even the simplest requests, like asking him to help with the dishes, were met with excuses, "I'm busy," or "I have other things to do." There was no effort to help, despite the fact that I worked tirelessly and managed the majority of the household responsibilities. When it came to finances, he had the nerve to ask me for rent for using the basement as my office, even though I contributed far more financially to the household than he did. All of this led to a breaking point. I finally confronted him about his laziness, his sense of entitlement, and his refusal to stand up to his overbearing mother. His behavior and the ongoing tension were making it hard to see a future for us. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. We were drifting further apart. Brian had become increasingly dependent on my efforts. I worked long hours, up to 13 hours a day, from home. Thanks to my senior position at the firm, despite the fact that I had fully purchased our home, I used the basement as my office. Yet Brian treated it like a rental space, demanding rent from me. This was the final straw. "I'm at my breaking point," I said, voicing my frustrations. "You need to take a stand for me, for us, and start contributing more. If things don't change, I can't keep pretending that divorce isn't an option." I hoped for some sign of understanding from him, but instead, he just fell silent. Then, he retreated to complain to his mother, who, in turn, lashed out at me, further escalating the situation. The tension reached a boiling point when my mother-in-law, emboldened by her son's complaints, confronted me with divorce papers, throwing them at me in a degrading manner. "You're destroying my son and your marriage," she accused, dismissing any attempt at reason. "Prepare these papers and sign them by tomorrow. I won't tolerate any resistance from someone as worthless as you," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. She taunted me about my upcoming move to their place for the summer, smugly relishing the control she thought she had over me. But I was done playing along. With a steady resolve, I shot back. "I think you've forgotten the reality of the situation. Brian's lifestyle, the gifts, the vacations, all of it is funded by my hard work. Don't think for a second that your position is secure." My words were sharp, cutting through the illusion she'd built and forcing her to confront the truth, one she had refused to see for far too long. In a confrontation laced with frustration, I laid it bare. "This lavish lifestyle, the gifts, the car, all financed by me. It's time you both understood that." She recoiled, disbelieving. "You're mistaken," she protested, unable to accept that I was the one footing the bill for everything, including Brian's dependence on my income and the rent he charged me to use my own space. "His laziness has gotten out of hand," I said, my patience finally running dry. Her denial was almost comical. "Brian would never live off someone else," she argued, refusing to see the truth. I fired back. "I've been more than generous. Both of you have taken advantage of that kindness, and it ends now. You're draining me, and I can't keep doing this." As I stared at the divorce papers, my potential ticket to freedom, she suddenly changed course. "Please, don't finalize this," she pleaded, surprising me with an apology. "I didn't know about the financial situation. I've been hush, and I'm sorry," but her apology felt hollow. Too little, too late. "An apology now?" I asked, incredulous. She continued to beg, confessing how she had played a role in enabling Brian's dependency. "I can't keep enabling this. You even want me to pay rent to live in my own house. That's absurd." I shot back, my resolve strengthening by the second. At that moment, Brian appeared, attempting to appeal to my sense of loyalty, but it was clear, the dream of a loving, supportive family was no longer attainable with him or his mother. Their attitudes had crushed any hope of that future. My decision was made. With a heavy heart but a clear mind, I stood firm against their manipulations. As I walked away, divorce papers in hand, I felt the weight of my decision, but I also felt a sense of relief. The dream of a harmonious family had become a distant fantasy, overshadowed by the harsh reality of a toxic environment. I knew I had to leave it behind for my own peace of mind. I reached my breaking point and called my mom and aunt, the two people who had always been my rock. I needed someone to listen, to help me make sense of the chaos at home. "I just don't know what to do anymore," I confided, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on me. I explained how Brian spent his days doing nothing, contributing nothing to our home, while I carried the financial burden, even paying rent in my own house just to give him spending money. Every conversation I'd tried to have with him had ended in defensiveness, leaving me feeling isolated and unsupported. "That's completely unfair to you, Victoria," my mom sympathized, anger and concern in her voice. "He should be pulling his weight, especially considering how hard you work." I felt a spark of clarity and resolve. I would have one more conversation with Brian, hoping that he could finally step up. But when I returned home, I found a series of desperate voicemails from Diana, pleading with me not to leave. Brian followed with his own hurtful remarks, accusing me of wanting a divorce for a long time. He even brought up Diana's new relationship with Gabriel, the very person who had tormented me in the past. His words stung. The way he echoed his mother's criticisms, telling me I wasn't good enough, left me speechless. The absurdity of it all hit me like a punch to the gut. "Not good enough?" I retorted, fury rising in me. "Have you even looked at yourself lately? You're unemployed, you don't take care of yourself, and yet you think I'm the problem?" I pointed out the glaring disparity between our efforts, and the frustration boiled over. Brian's reaction was a mix of disbelief and defiance, as though he couldn't fathom that I was serious. He seemed to think the divorce threat was just a dramatic move to make him reconsider his behavior, but I had no patience left for games. "This is madness," I declared, my decision unshakable. I told him about my conversation with my attorney and my intent to go through with the divorce. In one swift motion, I tossed $25,000 at him, his share of the basement. Brian and Diana stood frozen, stunned by my resolve, as I refused to sign the divorce papers. His questions were tinged with confusion. "What about us? Our life together?" he asked, still not grasping the magnitude of his actions. "Good luck," I replied, my heart heavy but my voice firm. "I hope you both manage, but don't ever contact me again. You need to leave by tonight." As I walked away from this chapter of my life, Brian's cries that none of this was fair to him echoed in the background, empty and meaningless. The decision was painful, but necessary. It was the only way I could reclaim my independence and dignity. After years of toxicity, leaving Brian and Diana behind was the first step toward finding peace and autonomy again. Despite Diana's pleas and her dramatic efforts to sway me, I knew I couldn't stay tangled in their negativity any longer. The person I had once believed Brian to be was nothing more than an illusion. Walking away was hard, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that was long overdue. The choice to move on wasn't without moments of reflection and guilt, especially after investing so much in a relationship that had only drained me. But the decision to forge a new path came from a determination to never allow myself to be manipulated again. With Brian and Diana gone, I began to rebuild my life. I moved to a new city, bought a home that symbolized a fresh start, and ventured into business promotion, collaborating with former colleagues to establish a new firm. It wasn't easy, but it was rewarding, and I could see the potential for growth and new opportunities. "Bobby, I really appreciate your support," I said to a colleague, feeling optimistic. "The future looks promising, and I'm excited about the possibilities for expansion." In addition to my career, my life was further enriched by adopting a son, my joy and my purpose. Our time together, whether playing in the park or simply basking in the sunlight, became my new definition of happiness. Still, the shadow of my past with Brian and Diana occasionally loomed. Diana would call every so often, asking for financial help, a reminder of the life I had left behind. "You and Brian are responsible for your own lives now," I told her firmly, my resolve as strong as ever. "While I wish you no harm, I can't continue to be your safety net." Diana's attempts to elicit sympathy by describing their dire financial situation, including Gabriel's abandonment, failed to sway me. "I've moved on from all of this," I said, closing that chapter for good. "I won't be pulled back into the mess you've created." My focus was now entirely on my son and the life we were building together. Far removed from the chaos of the past, I decided to give Diana one last opportunity to speak. Not wanting to set a poor example for my son by reacting out of anger, she shared a conversation with Gabriel, and the truth that came out only solidified my decision to sever all ties. "Gabriel, you've been distant. What's wrong?" Diana asked, seeking reassurance. "Diana, I can't keep pretending," Gabriel admitted. "I was only in this for the money. I thought being with you would get me closer to Victoria's inheritance, but now it's clear marrying you isn't going to get me anything." His brutal honesty shattered any illusions Diana had, as he made it clear that he saw her and Brian as nothing more than dead ends. He even described her as a financial burden due to her health, leaving Diana devastated. As I listened, I felt a mix of vindication and pity, but I remained firm in my decision to walk away. "It's unfortunata, Diana, but you have to take responsibility for your own choices. Don't contact us again. Good luck with everything, and I hope Brian figures it out," I said, ending the conversation and blocking any further communication from her. Soon after, I learned that Brian had found work as a custodian, a humble job that highlighted the depths of his financial struggles, but I didn't feel pity for him. His laziness and exploitation of my generosity had left me cold to his plight. Diana and Brian's situation worsened, with them eventually ending up in a shelter, and Brian even resorting to living under a bridge. Diana, because of her age, managed to find space in the shelter, but the toll their choices had taken on their lives was clear. Despite their circumstances, I kept my focus on my own future. My son and I had moved to a new home, leaving behind the one filled with painful memories. Our new house, complete with a pool, spa, and spacious yard, represented everything I had worked for. It was a fresh start, and each day spent in that peaceful space, swimming and playing in the yard, brought new joy and happiness. The future was bright, and the toxic past was finally behind us.